Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interviewed J.J. Strange, a history Ph.D. student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, to talk about the beginnings and difficulties of translating organic chemistry from European languages into Chinese during the mid and late 19th century. JJ, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I really like your research, and one aspect of your research that I really appreciate is how, a lot of times there's this stereotypical view of when China first encountered the Europeans en masse, they were resistant to change, or they were too conservative and didn't want to branch out. They just stuck to their own ways. But I think your research is challenging that conception very effectively, looking particularly at the sciences. I wanted to start out by giving a little bit of history to this. You talk about this idea of pattern translation between Jesuit missionaries and Chinese translators during the Ming Dynasty, and translating certain works by that of Euclid or other mathematical, philosophical, or scientific texts. Can you give a little more context to this and talk a little bit more about how these pattern translations worked?
So the earliest Europeans that really integrated into Chinese society would have been Jesuits, who are these sort of religious figures. But if you know anything about 16th, 17th century Europe, they were also the scientists of the day. And so they come over and they begin to, with sort of the goal of conversion, which doesn't necessarily go as planned, but, kind of portray themselves as these men of letters from Europe, and that they are able to sort of teach the learned men of China these different ways of knowing the world and understanding the world. And so they kind of start there. But the biggest challenge that they have almost right off the bat is the fact that the Chinese language is just bluntly a difficult language. And you not only do you have, regional, tonal, linguistic differences that are just can be very, very difficult to overcome. You also have this written language that is very, very standardized, but incredibly difficult to learn. People spend their entire lives learning it, especially in this time period. I mean, it was a job to be what we would call in English the literati, right? This sort of people who spent their lives studying, essentially. And so what ends up happening is essentially the Jesuit person gets good enough at Chinese to be able to communicate with their Chinese, counterpart, the people that they're teaching these subjects to. And then the people who are learning from them are getting good at either Latin or, probably one of the most famous Jesuits there is Matteo Ricci, who is Italian. So he's also teaching them, Italian, I'm assuming. And so, they're learning to communicate with one another. But when you want to spread the word, as one person, you can only encounter so many people. There's only so much, but their goal is to convert a country to Catholicism. How do we do that? Well, we're going to start with these small ways. We're going to start translating books. We're going to teach people how to do this. And then immediately encounter the problem of Chinese is hard to write and is highly, and we're not talking about modern Chinese, we're talking about classical Chinese, which is, if you've ever studied a little bit of classical Chinese, it's a whole other world. You need a dictionary to understand a character that you've learned since day one. Like, what do you do with that?
You're bringing back all the trauma of when I was taking my classical Chinese classes in graduate school.
It's brutal. I've taken 2 semesters, and it was a lot of fun, but very, very difficult. Once you get the hang of it and you realize it's more of a feeling. But how do you translate a feeling when you've got sort of these fairly scientific? I talk a little bit about mathematics, right? That's a pretty structured situation. You do this, you do that, you do this because of this, so on and so forth. You have these sort of axioms. And so how do you translate that? And then how do you translate that in a language where these words don't exist, right? The idea of geometry it's not a word. It doesn't exist. We have a word for it now, obviously in modern times, but that was created by these men. And so this is a partnership that they sort of enter in sort of translating and creating a system through which they can understand. And so that's kind of the basis. It wasn't, you know, different historians will have sort of different views on the role of the Jesuit versus the role of the Chinese, you know, individual in the partnership. But I mean, everything that I've seen really suggests that there is a fairly equal partnership, that there is sort of equal input into it. And they work really hard. And that was kind of the way they did it up until the 19th century. You had these big houses that were doing translations. So yeah, that's kind of the context in which this is happening.
So you talk about scientific translations really getting underway in the mid and late 19th century. Can you give the audience a little bit of an introduction into this interaction between European and Chinese translators in the mid and late 19th century, and talk about in detail some of the difficulties in translating? For example, you talk about how many scientific terms use Latin prefixes and suffixes. So how did they overcome difficulties in translating such as these?
So the 19th century is a little different in that you have a totally different China. So in, you know, early Jesuits are meeting China sort of on equal grounds. The idea is that these are equal, you know, groups of people. 19th century, that is not the case. You have significant imperial expansion from the British. European powers are desperate to, you know, colonize China in some way, whether that is to extract resources. There's wars that are being fought, the Opium Wars. And China, in response to that, begins to promote scientific education. And there's a faction of people who are really interested in what they call Western studies. This idea that you need to go and like learn these, you know, things that come from Europe, whether that's science, whether that's technology, you know, it's a lot of, or even political systems. They really begin to focus on this. And so what ends up happening is that as a part of that initiative to introduce xixue, the Western learning, they create what are called, you know, these translation, these translation houses, and they put state money into it. And they really begin to translate. The problem becomes is that you also have a lot of really deep, like, political things that are going on inside of China, right? You have the Taiping Rebellion, you have wars, you have, I mean, China itself is really struggling in this period, just, you know, trying to keep itself an independent country, also modernize, whatever that means. That's sort of a debated word among everyone hates this word, but we must use it. So, because there's not a better one. You know, they're trying to create that. And so what ends up happening in reality is that a lot of the translations actually, this partner translation begins to fall off, mostly because the people who are doing the translating are not experts in the field that they're translating. And so what ends up happening is that Japan, who is also participating in this sort of translation in, you know, East Asia at the time, they're not using hiragana and katakana, which are the syllabaries that we recognize today. They're actually using classical Chinese, or they're using Chinese characters at least, which they still use, but not quite to the extent, you know, they're still writing in classical at this point. And so a lot of this stuff gets imported over because at least it's readable. At least you do not need the English context or the, you know, Latin context or the French context, German context to understand what this is. And so there's a huge wave of sort of Japanese translations, which, you know, is kind of famous. It's sort of this famous that like China wasn't able to do it, but Japan did it. There's this narrative that sort of exists, but, and there's a big but here, there's a lot of these subjects that actually don't follow this pattern. Organic chemistry being kind of the biggest example in my opinion, mostly because I love organic chemistry. But it at the same time that Japan is doing a lot of these translations, they are also undergoing nationalism and becoming a nation. And part of that is establishing an identity outside of China. Like being like, we are not China, we are a separate entity, we are different. And that includes language. And that's how you get a lot of these syllabaries, which were initially like intended as pedagogical tools to teach people how to read Chinese, like the characters. So you have this movement away from Chinese characters, and then you get this weird movement. So there's a lot of parts here. So we've got Japan kind of having this movement away from like what they would call kanji, which are Chinese characters. And then in Europe, you have the standardization process where this idea is like, okay, everybody, look, we're all speaking different languages and we've got 8 names for things and nobody knows what anyone's talking about. No one can tell when someone's made a new discovery, nobody knows who's doing what, and it just depends on who your teacher is, and like, we can't have this. This is too much. And so they decide like, hey, we're gonna like make up a lot of like organizations, and they do this for all sorts of places. But the organic chemistry one, which is a fairly new field at this point, right? It's a early 19th century kind of growth out of what we would call just chemistry in general, this idea. And so they create what's called IUPAC, which is the standardized naming system. Yeah, so there's this other thing happening, and then you have China, who is trying to translate all of this. So Japan has taken the path of what is called transliteration, where they just take the sounds and they translate it into, you know, a syllabary. And you learn that sound, you learn those things, and that's the word, and that's what it becomes. And that works for sure. Like, that is an absolutely valid form of translation. It doesn't really work in China, in Chinese, because you end up with words that are 8, 9, 10 characters long. And if, you know, you and I know a little bit about Chinese, and if you get more than 4 characters, it starts getting a little dicey. Like, most people are like, we're going to shorten that word. And so they had to come up with a solution, because like the person that had kind of been helping them solve their problem wasn't producing. Also at this point, you know, we're moving more into like the early 20th century. Japan and China are really at odds with one another, right? We've had the Sino-Japanese War. You know, in 20 years, in 20 plus years, Japan is going to invade, right? There's complicated things going on, not that they know that, but the tension is definitely there. And so they look at this and they go, okay, what are these pieces? What is, you know, organic chemistry nomenclature, which is just a fancy way of saying organic chemistry names. And all it is a list of the number of carbons, the list of the types of bonds, and the list of the sort of what we would call functional groups, which is just these standardized pieces of the chemical, of the compound that we recognize as like a particular reactivity. And then, you know, add on like different pieces of, you know, from the periodic table occasionally to make it fun. And so so what they did is they went, okay, well, wait a second, we have all these pieces. We can do this, we can name this. And so the one thing that they had to come up with, they being the translators, is they go, okay, wait a second, we have to make a new word, because we actually don't have a word, because none of these words are real words. Well, that's not fair. They are real words, but they are made up in that moment to do this very specific thing. And that's what China does. They go, okay, well, we've got some characters that we can kind of like add a fire radical to, or we can add, you know, a tree radical to, or we can add, you know, whatever. And we'll say it says it, we say it like this, and then that is what it's going to mean. And that's what we're going to teach people.
I was struck in your research because you talk about how, for scientists, this language disconnect between both Westerners and Chinese was, in some ways, kind of freeing for the scientists because it allowed them to construct these new characters or sound combinations. So, with those difficulties came some benefits with them.
It's really interesting because there's this idea that like translators have like this unique grasp on language. But I find that at least in this case, right, that these translators were experts in their field and they looked at a problem and they went, we need to solve this problem. Because these scientists, so the scientists who are sort of undergoing this language reform, have the benefit of having gone to another country, studied in another language, and understand what's going on. So these are the study abroads. But then they're asked to come back to China and teach people who have never spoken another language, who are not, you know, proficient in English, which at the time was kind of on the rise in terms of like scientific language. They have to figure out a way to teach people. And so they go, okay, well, what is this basic thing? And the only way that you can understand something at its most base parts, to understand that it is numbers, carbons, connectivity, right, is that you know what organic chemistry is. And so they had to be experts. And I think that that really helps them break it down to its simplest parts and solve a problem that had been there for a really long time. Since, you know, organic chemistry had always been this transliterated thing, and it made it incredibly difficult. One of my favorite things is one of the early translators of organic chemistry, in his foreword, complains about how hard it is to translate organic chemistry because the names are too long. Like, he just says, like, it's so hard to do this. Nobody can understand it. How are we going to solve this? And so, yeah, I think it's really awesome that they were. I think it's really important to remember that these are scientists first and not translators, that they are sort of put into that role in a secondary way because out of necessity, right?
You touch on this a little bit, but in your research, why do you think it's so important to shift so much of the focus away from the Japan-China dynamic in terms of that transmission? Because it wasn't just translation projects going on in the sciences, but also in the humanities and the arts and the literatures. Why is it that when we look at organic chemistry in particular, you feel it's so important to shift the focus away from Japan as being that bridge between the West and China?
I think that there has been, and this is the case for a lot of things when it comes to China, where China becomes this thing and Japan becomes its permanent, like, historical buddy, and they constantly follow each other around. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. As a Chinese historian, I'm expected to learn. I have learned Japanese, right? That is just an expectation that we have, that these two kind of are married together. But the problem is that China's, and Japan for that matter, are a part of a global system, particularly at this point, right? By the time the Jesuits roll in to China, they come in and they begin doing their sort of conversion. You have colonization going on in the Americas, right? It puts, by de-emphasizing the relationship between Japan and China, we can then emphasize the global relationship that China has with Europe, with, you know, America. When you move into the 19th century, there's so much more going on that I think when we focus so hard on a single region, we miss a lot. And I'm not saying that Japan didn't assist China, that relationship doesn't exist. I'm just saying that there are other things going on, and that China wasn't responding to Japan failing them in translation. China was responding to the scientists in Europe who were saying, hey, we're going to standardize this language. And they went, okay, well, we need to do that too. And they're participating in this moment, this episode of standardization. And they're doing so in a way that makes sense for their country to teach people, right? It's all feeding into this narrative of nationalism. It's feeding into, we are going to modernize. But it's also, you know, responding to a global community of scientists who are saying, this is what we're doing now. So, yeah.
So in your view, how have the successes and failures of transmission of scientific concepts and terms between Europe and China provided useful lessons for scientific exchanges and the creation of new scientific ideas and concepts today? And as an extension of this question, how is the legacy of these translations thought of and talked about in scientific communities in China in today's times?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is like, it's important, I think, looking at these translations to understand that science isn't this like, oh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Science isn't this absolute that just exists outside of context, outside of culture, outside of time. I think that there's sort of this myth that exists in our society today where people look at science and it's always been this way, and it's like actually it's a discussion, right? It's a movement of paradigms. It's a change over a long period of time, right? That's why there is a history of science that's looking at why did this happen here versus here. So with China and looking at this translation, it's understanding how knowledge moves from one place to another and becomes knowledge in another place. So, for example, the idea of chemistry, let's just keep going on this thing. The idea of chemistry is a bit odd, right? We're like, okay, we're going to look at these really itty bitty like chemicals, these little itty bitty things that we call elements, which, okay. And we're going to see how they connect together, and we're going to see what happens when we put them together. Sometimes they explode, sometimes they kill you, sometimes they make like a nice smell. And so, but there's reasons why people started doing that in the first place, right? Whether it was curiosity, whether it was this. And so, and then once somebody has an idea, they want to tell somebody. And so they tell other people, and so on and so on and so on. But when you talk to people outside of your circle, right, you start running into problems of culture. You start running into problems of language, which again, I think really points to the fact that science and scientific discovery and the way that we interact with science is a really cultural, thing. It's not this absolute. So for China today, so Matteo Ricci, who is the Jesuit that we spoke of sort of at the beginning, is kind of one of the first to really do a lot of these translations. I mean, he gets a lot of like veneration in some ways. But today, these translations, I mean, the thing that I find so fascinating is a lot of these early translations, even though they could have been redone, they could have been made, quote unquote, more accurate, whatever that could possibly mean. But they don't, they live on, right? They become a part of the lexicon, which is just a fancy word for saying a part of the language. It becomes this idea that, and standards, it becomes like standards of how we do translation. Like a lot of these standards are still used. I cannot tell you, modern organic chemistry papers that are coming out, they're using this system that I'm talking about. It works. And as long as it works, whether or not I think, oh, maybe they should have done this or maybe they should have done that, it doesn't matter because it works and it makes it accessible to people, right? It makes it accessible when you don't speak English. It makes it accessible. I can sit with somebody and show them a chart of translations and they can translate an organic chemistry paper in Chinese without ever having learned the language because they can match. They can figure out what the chemicals are. I can show them a few words for like, this is a reaction, this is this, and they can essentially have the paper. And, the way that the scientific community works as of right now is that, a lot of it's English. There's a really great book by Michael Gordon called Scientific Babble, How Science Was Done Before and After Global English. Which is this book about how English became the language of, science and of sort of internationalism, but that's really not the case anymore. There's tons of papers that are published in India that are not in English. And people sit there and wait, and they're like, what's it gonna be in English so we can read it? It's like, okay. Versus, In China, same thing. There's lots of papers that are published that are not translated into English, and everyone's sitting there like, well, it's not in English, so we can't read it. This idea. So I would say that there is a movement right now, for better or for worse, away from a sort of unified language in science. Most people who operate in science have to speak some form of English, but that English literacy is going down and down and down. So what comes next? I don't know, probably what happened similarly in the 19th century in Europe, where there were sort of 3 or 4 competing languages that everyone kind of had to be able to function in. We'll see. It's always changing. It's always, dependent on global politics. It's dependent on a lot of things. But yeah, I think that this is an insight into how a society really takes on a new concept and turns it into something that is totally intelligible to the people who wouldn't have spoken the original language or wouldn't have been in the original place and learned it from those people. And that's always necessary. That understanding how ideas travel, I think, is a really important part of understanding people in general and understanding how people interact with new ideas. It becomes a puzzle for them to solve. Like, how am I going to tell my friends about this awesome idea? Well, I got to translate it, or I got to do this, or I got to do that. Like, that's so cool. So, yeah.
If someone's listening to an episode of this podcast and they're interested in knowing more about translations in China, the history of science, etc., what would be 1 or 2 books that you would recommend that they read?
On Their Own Terms, Science in China from 1550 to 1900 by Benjamin Ellman is probably the first book I ever read that got me like thinking about this in the first place. That I was like, oh, like there's a whole history here. Like, what's going on? I think it's also an easy to read book. I really enjoyed it. Another one, which is a edited volume, so it's going to be a bunch of essays kind of put together, but it's Science and Technology in Modern China, 1880s to the 1940s. That's also by Benjamin Ellman, but with editor, sorry, it's not by Benjamin Ellman, it's edited by Benjamin Ellman and I believe Jing Su. So those are really good places to start. Also, you'll start getting names of people who are writing about this. I'm very narrow. I can give you lots of like history of chemistry, but I think for like broad, those are really, really good places to start.
JJ, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.